Last Sam's Cage by David A. Poulsen, Chapter 12, page 129. It would rain that day. Eddie could feel it before he crawled out of the condo. Even though he couldn't see the sky, it felt early, too, though he couldn't tell for sure. There was one more thing he'd forgotten when he took off: a watch. He hoped he could pick one up in the B&E. It would be nice to know the time without having to stare into strangers' arms or into office windows. He didn't feel like going into one of the buildings to get warm, so he walked instead. After a while, he felt better, not chilled anymore. He sat down on one of the park benches and watched the traffic go by on the street that ran along the south border of the zoo. He felt the presence of someone beside him before he heard or saw the person, and he turned his head slowly to the left. Jack Sim was no more than an arm length away. He was poking his stick at the ground and staring at Eddie. He didn't say a word. You ever just walk up to somebody without sneaking up on them? Eddie let his voice show his displeasure at the intrusion. It's better hard to knock, Jack replied. Eddie nodded, but didn't say anything more. He wondered what had brought Jack to the zoo this early. Jack poked the ground a while longer, then looked up. If you're awake, let's go. Eddie didn't move. Where? Let's go, Jack repeated. He dropped the stick on the ground and started walking. For the first time, Eddie noticed that Jack had a bit of a limp. He guessed the old man might get stiff on cool, damp mornings like this one. Probably arthritis or one of those other things people Jack's age always seemed to talk about. Jack didn't look back. It was like he knew that you'd do what he'd expected you to do without a lot of fuss. Eddie splashed some water from a drinking fountain onto his face and stood up. All right, he thought. I'll play your little game just to see what this is all about. Besides, there was always the chance that Jack would buy him breakfast, which would be just fine. But this didn't have anything to do with breakfast. Jack was walking fast, stiffness or not, and Eddie had to hurry to keep up. It was like when you were little and you had to sort of walk trot to keep up with your mom when she took you shopping. Except this wasn't shopping, and it wasn't his mom, and Eddie was getting impatient. He stopped. This is far as I go until I get some more information, he called ahead to Jack, who hadn't slowed down. Jack stopped and then looked back at him. It isn't far now, he said, and began walking again. That was a lie. They walked for a long time, long enough to end up in part of the zoo Eddie had never seen before. In fact, he wasn't sure they were actually in the zoo anymore. Finally, Jack stopped, allowing Eddie to catch up. As Eddie struggled to catch his breath, he noticed that Jack was breathing normally. The old guy might be a little stiff, but he was in damn good shape, Eddie decided. A long minute passed before Jack pointed. What are we looking at? Eddie asked. All I see is the freeway. The edge of the freeway. The edge nearest to us. That clump of brush straight ahead. You see it? Yeah. That's where they found my little sister. Right there. He paused before adding, You wanted to know about it? You might as well know all of it. So that was it. Jack knew Eddie had been in his house. But how? Eddie decided not to ask. He also decided not to play dumb. They both knew this wasn't the time for stupid denials. I'm sorry, Eddie said. I wasn't trying to invade your privacy or anything. I didn't know anything about you, and I wanted to. I mean, you have to admit, it's pretty weird. This guy comes to the zoo every day for all these years and spends most of his time watching little kids at the playground. Hell, I didn't know what you were all about. Jack leaned back, half sitting on a boulder. He looked at Eddie, then closed his eyes. "It's my fault," he said, in a voice Eddie could barely hear over the freeway noise. "I was supposed to be watching her, but my friends and I were playing kick the can. When I went to find her, she was gone. I was supposed to watch her, and I didn't. And a sick son of a bitch came along and got her out. And herein, those clippings didn't tell everything that guy did to my sister. You want to know that too?" No, I don't. But I'll bet you want to know why. Why I sit there watching those kids every day, don't you? Maybe you think I'm just as weird as the guy that brought my little sister right over there and strangled her after Jack hadn't opened his eyes, and Eddie knew he was seeing it all over again, just the way it had been all those years before. Mom and Dad, they looked for her all that night, and the next day the police searched. The neighbors did too, and lots of people we didn't even know. It took them 2 days to find her. My mom was never right after that. She died a few years later, mostly because she didn't want to live. My dad tried, but he wasn't the same either. The rest of us kids, we got sent to BC to live with my aunt. That was better in a way. At least out there, not many people knew us. When we still lived here, I bet somebody said something every day. "Sim," they'd say. "I know that name. Are you related to that poor child?" Most of them knew before they asked, but they had to ask anyway. Jack opened his eyes but didn't look at Eddie. Instead, he stared off at the place where Angela Sim had died all those years before. But Eddie wasn't sure that Jack was seeing the place just then, or that he was seeing anything except maybe the pictures in his mind. I tried working at a couple of jobs out at the coast, but I could never stop thinking about it. There wasn't a single minute of the day I didn't remember. But even so, I started to think I was going to be okay. Then I got a job on the ferries going between Vancouver and Victoria. I liked the job. I liked the sea. One day a guy from Calgary got on the ferry. He knew me, at least he knew my family, and he recognized me. We weren't 5 minutes away from the dock when he came up to tell me how sorry he was about what had happened, and that I shouldn't blame myself. His saying that made me realize that the whole damn world knew I was supposed to be looking after my sister that day. I knew I had to do something. I wasn't sure what, but something, or go crazy. There was a war on Vietnam. I thought maybe going someplace far away and shooting people I didn't know anything about might somehow help. They were both quiet for a time. Traffic sounds surrounded them, and a jet flew overhead on its descent into the airport. Did it? Jack took a long time answering. It was as if he'd forgotten Eddie was there. "No," he said in the same low voice. "It didn't help. When I got back, I mostly just wandered around. Did enough to eat every day and have a place to sleep. Not much more. Then one day it came to me. I knew exactly what I had to do. I had to come back here and sit by the playground and make sure nothing like that happened to my sister ever happened again. It isn't the same playground. They pulled that down a long time ago, but it's close to the one where..." Jack closed his eyes again. Eddie looked to see if he was crying, but he wasn't. Maybe after a while he stopped crying, even after something as awful as what had happened to Jack. Eddie couldn't think of anything to say. He couldn't think of any words that could possibly make difference or even make sense. And he didn't understand either. He didn't understand how a person's guilt could be so great that he would give up his own life to sit at that playground all those days, all those years. Surely no one could ever have blamed Jack for what happened, but maybe it didn't matter. Not if you blamed yourself. Jack stood up and began walking back the way they had come. Eddie figured Jack wouldn't want him along, so he stayed where he was, looking at the ground. He was afraid to look up in case his eyes strayed back to that place by the freeway. Jack stopped and turned back. "Don't ever break into my house again," he said, his voice only slightly louder than it had been. "You want to know something? You ask." He turned and Eddie watched him disappear around the bend and behind some trees.